Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, dependiendo de dónde nos acompañen. Hoy
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you join us. We get together virtually to commemorate the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women. In 1999, the General Assembly of the United Nations established November 25th as the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women in commemoration of the murdering of the sisters Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa Mirabal, known as the Butterflies, three activists of resistance against Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship in Santo Domingo. This commemoration is the result of a series of efforts that initiated in the decade of the 80s, since in 1981 had been declared the International Day Against Violence Towards Women in the first feminist Latin American and Caribbean feminist meeting celebrated in Bogota. Currently, this day, the 25th of November, starts the Únete or Join Us campaign by the General Secretary of the United Nations to prevent and eliminate violence against women and young girls in the world. This campaign since 2008 is an effort of years that stimulates governments, civil society, to women's organizations, youths, private sector, communication, media, and all of the systems of the United Nations to gather efforts to cover the global pandemic of violence against women and girls. This global campaign is called Paint the World Orange and the Violence Against Women globally of 16 days of activism against women and girls violence starting today, November 25th, and last until November 10th, the International Day of Human Rights. This campaign also invites that every 25 of each month is Orange Day, a day oriented to generating awareness and to go to actions to end violence against women and girls. This specific scenario that we have of COVID 2019 has us brought together in a virtual format to commemorate such a day with a subject that from the group work of the OLACEFS of gender equality and non-discrimination on such a non-touched situation of our organization, Sextortion. To open the subject of this debate, I leave you with the General Comptroller of the Chilean Republic and President of the Group of Work on Gender Equality and Not Discrimination of OLACEFS, Mr. Jorge Benudo Soto. He is lawyer of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso and with a doctorate in law and master's in European communitary rights at the Madrid Autonomous University, Spain. He has also done postdoctoral studies in environmental law at Gießen University and Heidelberg University in Germany. Since December 17, 2015, he has been General Comptroller of the Chilean Republic, where he is also the Executive Secretary of the Latin American Organization and the Caribbean of Superior Fiscalizing or Auditing Entities, OLACEFS, since 2017. Under its administration, the General Comptroller of the Republic was chosen by the General Assembly of the UN to be member of its Board of Auditors, whom he presides since last year. As I've noticed, he is also president of the Group of Work on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination since its creation 2020. So, Mr. Comptroller, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Daniela. Good morning, good afternoon to those who join us with this activity on this webinar on sextortion that, just like Daniela pointed out, is a violent issue against women that has been little treated and which often is invisibilized in our societies. Today, just as pointed out, we commemorate the Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is on November 25th. In Chile, data is not good. The femicide rate is constant since 2019 without noticeable decreases. Sextortion is another form of violence. Political violence, which was the fact that generates today's commemoration, which is a form of violence against women. Thus, under the framework of our organization, the Organization of Superior Auditing Entities of Latin America and the Caribbean, we've created a work group, a gender equality group to be able to go towards the studies of these issues. During this year, the OLACEFS Gender Group that the Chilean Comptroller's Office has presided has worked on the development of an important issue, which is gender equality policy in our organization. OLACEFS did not have a policy on the subject, and the diagnosis that we carried out at the beginning of the year wasn't stimulating in gender terms. So we went to the task, and a first way place this subject is specifically to tell with and share a full policy. This policy is participative. It's a policy carried out among all in OLAFSEFs with permanent participation through different work groups and virtual meetings that we've been able to carry out due to the pandemic virtually in our organization. And we hope that next General Assembly of the OLACEFs, this gender policy can be approved formally. Today, the International Elimination of Violence Against Women Day reminds us that sextortion is also a way of corruption. When we use this form of violence against women to be able to obtain something in exchange, just like the slogan of the webinar that we are inaugurating today says, shows us that it's a phenomenon that is produced in our societies and produced in different states and governments, thus can be considered a corruption element. We must remember that this year, the General Assembly of the United Nations, in its declaration made under this special assembly done regarding against corruption, made special note on paragraph 69 where corruption affects differentiatedly women and other minority groups, thus going towards sextortion as a manifestation that may be product of corruption inside of the government is important for superior auditing entities that make part of OLACEFs. I do not want to monopolize the conversation. I just wish to point out that for us as work group in gender issues at OLACEFs, it's an honor to have the participation of our panelists. And also of great importance is that for us, it is not a different issue. Sextortion as manifestation of violence against women is a relevant issue that we wish to place in note that until recently has been invisibilized in our societies and thus its relevance day to day, like today, the International Day for Violence Elimination Against Women, we can place it facing all in our communities of superior auditing entities and thus are able to hear the support and comments to be received and hope to receive also the participation of those whom participate. Thank you to the work group who for organizing this activity. Thank you for your words, Comptroller, and your leadership in the subject without a doubt allows to generate these spaces to formally open the conversation on sextortion. We have three expert panelists in the subjects, which I will present next. Mrs. Susana Medina de Rizo is a lawyer, ex-president of the International Society of Women Judges, and main title league of Argentinian judge women, participated in 2017 in a preparatory meeting for the launching of a global network against United Nations corruptions at the United Nations Convention Centers in Austria, where she presented this group on sextortion. We are also joined by Analina Solana Lopez, lawyer and consultant of Euro Social Plus, an experienced academic with and a professional in penal, political, and criminal law with emphasis on financial economic crime, a professor and researcher at the Externado University of Colombia, and a specialist in corruption and gender. Also joining us, we have Lourdes Paramon. She is a degree in law by the University of Barcelona with a post-degree in mediation by the Council of School of Lawyers of Catalonia. She's a specialist in corporate integrity and empresarial or business culture, and also chief of the area of institutional relationships of the Antifrau Catalunya office, where since 2019 has organized, moderated a course on gender, power, and corruption where she exposes this subject of sextortion. Before starting the panelists and conversation, we will invite everyone whom to join us to interact with us through the Menti platform. Thus, we invite
www.menti.com, usar el código
www.menti.com
para
and use
descargos
the code
58 74 54 para responder
7454
la pregunta
to
¿a
answer
quién
the
le ha hablado de
question.
usted
Have you
o
ever
conoce a
had,
alguien
or do you
a
know
quien alguna
someone
autoridad le haya
whom an
solicitado o le haya
authority has
exigido o
asked
indirecto un
directly or
favor sexual?
indirectly a sexual
Les
favor
hacemos la
for?
invitación para que
We
vayan a
ask the
menti.com
invitation so that
con
you
el
go to
código
menti.com with the
4254
code
y ahí nos
4250
de manera que puedan responder la pregunta ¿conoce a
587454,
alguien
so that
a quien una
if you
autoridad le
know
haya
someone
solicitado de manera directa
whom
o
an
indirecta
authority
un
has
favor
asked
sexual?
directly or
Nos
indirectly
estaremos
a
volviendo
sexual
con
favor. We will be
los
back
resultados
now
para poder
with the
comentarlos con
results
nuestro
to be
panel.
able to comment them with our
Por
panel.
lo pronto,
And
también
soon
les hago llegar las
I
excusas
will
por la
also make
participación
the excuses
presencial, digamos,
of the
sincrónica
participation or
de Mrs.
synchronic
Susana
participation
Medina,
of Mrs.
que
Susana
lamentablemente
Medina,
por
whom
compromisos
unfortunately, due
institucionales
to
no
institutional
estará aquí en
commitments,
nuestro
will not
conversatorio
be
de
able to
manera
be
sincrónica,
present
pero
in
sí
our
nos ha dejado un
conversation
mensaje
synchronically, but has
escrito.
left us a
Vamos
message.
a invitarles
Thus, we
a
will invite
escuchar
everyone to
en sus
hear,
palabras
in her
sobre
words,
qué es la sextorsión y
what
qué lo distingue de
sextortion
otros
is
actos.
and what it distinguishes it from harassment, general harassment.
Muy buenas tardes. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer al Grupo de Trabajo sobre Igualdad de Género y No Discriminación,
Gender
OLACEFS,
equality and
la Contraloría
non-discrimination of
de la
OLACEFS
República
and the
Nacional
General
Argentina
Comptroller's
de
Office of
Chile por
Chile,
esta
our
cordial
sister
invitación
Republic of
y
Chile,
además
for
para
this nice
reflexionar
invitation made to
y
think
conversar
about
sobre un
and
tema de
talk
innegable
about an
actualidad
issue
como es
of
esta
current
conducta
day
corrupta
subject
de
of
la
this corrupt
sextorsión.
conduct of sextortion.
Durante muchos años,
During many, many years,
las personas que han ocupado
people whom have
puestos de
used
autoridad
authority
han podido
positions,
ver y en algunos casos ser
in some cases,
tristes testigos
have
privilegiados
been
de conductas
privileged,
que no
sad
sabían
witnesses
cómo
of
llamarlas
conducts that
y que
they did not know
motivó
how to call,
que
and which
la
motivated
Asociación Internacional de
the
Mujeres Jueces
International Society
empezara
of
a investigar el
Women
tema
Judges to
allá por el año
to begin to
2008
investigate the
y
subject towards
comenzó con el
2008,
apoyo
and it
del
began with the
gobierno de
support
los Países
of
Bajos
the
que
support of the
apoyaron
Netherlands government,
económicamente a una
whom supported us
investigación
economically in the
en
research,
distintos países y en distintos
different countries
continentes,
and in different
en la
continents.
República de Bosnia y
In
Herzegovina,
the
en
Bosnian
Uganda, en
Republic, in
Tanzania, en
Uganda,
Filipinas
Tanzania,
y en
Philippines,
Argentina.
and in Argentina.
En todos estos
In
países y
all of
diferentes
these countries
continentes
of different
había
continents,
un
there was
patrón de conducta
a common
similar. Una persona
similar
de
behavioral
poder
pattern, someone in an
que
authority
abusaba
position
de una persona
whom
que
abuses of
estaba
someone who is
condiciones
in
desfavorables y
favorable
que
conditions
no le pedía
and
nada más
who did not
ni
ask
ninguna
anything
otra cosa que no
else or
fuera
anything
sexo.
else
Es decir,
than a sexual
los
favor. In
extorsionaba,
other
los
words,
extorsionaba para
extortion
obtener
towards
el sexo.
obtaining
La moneda de
sex.
cambio era sexo,
The
no era dinero.
currency for exchange
Entonces,
was
la
sex and not
Asociación
extortion.
Internacional de
Thus,
Mujeres Jueces, después de hacer
the International
actividades en
Society of
distintos
Women
países y
Judges,
distintos
after doing the
continentes,
activities in
como
different
dije,
countries
llegó a
and
la
continents, has
conclusión
said,
de que
reached
esta
the conclusion
conducta
that this conduct,
antigua pero poco
this old,
visibilizada y tampoco
little
tipificada y
visibilized
tampoco
conduct
legislada,
and
era
non-typified
nueva
or
y una
legislated conduct
sutil
was a
forma de
new way,
corrupción
subtle way of
y
for
una
corruption,
conducta que combinaba
and a
el
conduct
abuso del poder, el abuso de la
bind
autoridad
abuse of
para
power,
obtener
authority
sexo a
to
cambio.
obtain
Entonces
sex
lo
in
denominamos
exchange.
sextorsión,
So
que
it
es
was
una
called
suma de
sextortion,
las
which is a
palabras
sum
sexo y
of
extorsión
words like
que
sex and
captura
extortion,
y
which
transmite
captures
la
and
esencia de lo que
transmits
significa, es
the
decir,
essence of
el
what
abuso
it
de la
means.
autoridad
In other
para
words, the
obtener
abuse of
sexo
authority to
eh,
obtain
que lo diferencia del acoso
sex,
sexual.
which
¿Y por qué
is
del acoso sexual?
differentiated
Esto es una
from
conducta que
sexual
se da en el
harassment.
ámbito
Why?
laboral,
Because harassment
fundamentalmente.
in an
Los
environment of
procedimientos, la
employment.
persecución.
It's the
Y
harassment
acá
prosecution
esto
related
se
to it.
da
But
en
here
todos los
it is
ámbitos,
seen
no
in all
solamente en el
senses,
ámbito
not
laboral,
only
porque por
in the
ejemplo se ha
employment field,
dado
because, for
en
example, it has been
campos de
seen
refugiados,
in
se ha
refugee
dado
camps, it
en
has
la
been seen
frontera cuando hay mujeres que quieren
on
cruzar la
borders when
frontera
people
y
wish to
el
cross
guardia de
borders and
frontera les
migrate,
pide sexo
and a
a
border
cambio de dejarla
crossing
pasar.
guard
Se ha dado
asks for sex in exchange of passing, and also in the penitentiary systems when women wish to visit family members and sex is asked in exchange. Thus, in different senses, in different areas, the employment field, and it plays not only with harassment, also a form of prosecution, but also play a fundamentally with psychologic harassment, with a psychologic threat, more than with physical threat. And how can would this be defined? Well, the abuse of power that a person with authority exacts on other obtaining a benefit, advantage, or sexual favor of the person whom specifically is in disadvantage. So it is fundamentally seen in these asymmetrical relationships of power fundamented on the patriarchy and gender violence. And there is more than just a physical effort, there is a psychological aspect here. And what's sextortion is distinguished from other sexual behaviors like harassment is that it has two components. One component, which is the sexual element, and the corruption element. Thus, we talked in the global network of judicial integrity of the United Nations Office Against Drugs and Crime, which is considered as a way of corruption, special way of corruption, in fact. And the formula, as I said before, is that sex, see this abuse of power, which definitely is translated into what we call sextortion since 2008, 2009.
Genial introducción. Entonces,
Very
a
good
este tema
introduction then to the
toca
subject at hand
doña Susana
on
Medina.
behalf
Linda,
of Miss Susana
empecemos
Medina.
con
Ana
lo que
Linda then,
ella
starting from
suscita, estos dos
what
elementos
Susana
de
indicates, these two
¿por qué
elements.
es un tipo de
Why
corrupción la
is
sextorsión?
it a
¿A
type
quiénes
of
afecta? Bueno, sabemos que a las
corruption?
mujeres,
Whom does it affect?
pero
We
para
know that
muchos hombres,
women,
¿cuáles serían
but
los
why
contextos?
and what would be these contexts?
Gracias, Daniela, por la
Thank you,
pregunta. Muy
Daniela, for the
recientemente
question.
el contexto que
Very
nos han dado.
context that you've
¿Por
given
qué es
us.
corrupción?
Why
Explicaba muy
is it
bien
corruption? And this was
Susana.
very well explained
Em,
by Mrs.
Hay
Susana.
un componente
There
de
is a
corrupción en la
component for
relación
corruption in the
cuando hay un quid
relationship
pro quo.
when there is a
Es
quid
decir, cuando
quo pro.
para
In other
acceder
words, when
a
to
circunstancias
access circumstances
muy
that
seguramente a las que
very
tengo derecho
assuredly that I
por un
have a right
servicio
towards
público, por
because it
ejemplo,
is a public
se me
service, for
condiciona
example,
este
and I
acceso
am
a cambio de un mal
conditioned to
llamado
this
favor
access
sexual. Entonces, aquí lo que
in
estamos
exchange
viendo
for a
es un
sexual
típico
favor. So what we
caso
see here is a typical case
de soborno, de cohecho, de
of bribing,
extorsión, de
of
limosna, pero tengo que tener
requests for a bribe,
la apertura de
but
mente
we
para
have to
entender
have an
qué
opening of
son
mind to
esas
understand that there are
modalidades,
diverse
manera de pago. Muchas
ways
veces
and
esa
currencies.
moneda de
And
pago no es
often this
solamente
currency
el
for payment
dinero.
is not
Cuando
only
pensamos
money.
corrupción,
When we think of
asociamos corrupción
corruption,
a
we
grandes
associate
casos de
corruption
corrupción
to
como
large
estos
corruption
grandes casos que
cases,
hemos tenido en la región
these
de América
large
Latina,
corruption
y
cases
al
that we've had
dinero
in America
en
and
sí,
Latin
las
America, and money.
legislaciones no lo
And thus,
limiten,
our
o sea, el
legislation
concepto de favor o
concept
pago no lo limite
should
a dinero,
not be limited
nuestra mente asocia eso. Entonces, acá la
to our
invitación es
minds with
entender
associates. So
que
here are the limiting
con un
factors to
sesgo de
understand
género, es decir,
that with
no es
gender
ningún
bias, in other
otro
words,
género
it's not any
que
other
pueda ser
gender
expuesto a esto. Lo que
will
sí es
not
que
be
los números
exposed to
de
this.
lo
It's
que
that the
hizo, por ejemplo, el
figures,
barómetro
as for example
global de la corrupción
expressed
en América
in the
Latina y el Caribe de
global
2019
barometer
muestra una
of
referencia
corruption in
internacional
Latin
en
America
que
and
una
Caribbean,
de cada
which
5
was
personas
on
manifiesta
women, one
sufrir
in every five
un tema de
person
extorsión sexual al acceder
manifest
a servicios públicos o
sexual
conocer
extortion by
gente de bajo
accessing
perfil.
public
¿Sí?
services or someone who
Entonces
has
vemos que
or knows someone who
se
has
ha medido
gone through
poco,
this
pero las
situation.
mediciones indican que hay
So
un sesgo importante de género. En Perú se ha
this
medido en el
there is quite a
2012
bit
y en
of
el 2019
gender bias seen,
las
and in
diferencias que
Peru
muestra es que a una mujer se le
2019
solicita un
shown differences that
54%,
while
el
it is
favor
requested to
sexual,
women at
a
54%,
un hombre se le solicita
sexual
un
for
4%.
favors to
Entonces
men
son
only
indicaciones que
4%
muestran
is
que hay un
requested. These are
sesgo. Entonces no
indications
es
that there
per se,
is
no
gender
es un tema
bias.
de
It's not per
violencia
se
política,
nor
pero
a
sí es
women's violence issue specifically, but it is relevant in this way as it is manifested. And it also has to do because it's women who majority access to these services. Let us imagine that we wish to access, in this context of COVID, to a mechanical ventilator because someone may be quite serious in health and official coerces sex from them. So imagine a woman who has a child sick and someone's asking sex in exchange of a machine use. Thus, in the region in Latin America and also in Spain and US context, we've detected situations where in exchange of accessing public services, education, health, justice, service, documentation, business entrepreneurship, among others, these types of payments are requested. Thus, if there's no money to which to pay with, it doesn't mean that bribing is exempted because there are effectively other ways to pay. There are other situations where also vulnerability is larger. And I think the situation is made more serious. We're talking about sextortion towards public service accesses and also sextortion in cases where, for example, there are people whom are victims of people slavery and people commerce where an exploitation may have access to or have it's not only payment with money but also sexual services of the exploited women. And this context of immigration of importance that we're living in Latin America, there's even more vulnerability. Thus, it's this awareness of understanding that this quid pro quo that corruption presents us, this exchange, this abuse of power is requests different forms of payment to access to what one has a right upon just because it's a public service. Now, the comptroller talked at the beginning of the seminar, at the beginning of the conversation, of invisibilization of these issues. And clearly, this is one of the large issues. And it's good that we have enough information of how it's manifested in the region. But additional to invisibilization, I would suggest normalization. In other words, the non perception of the person whom receives this sexual extortion that the judge mentions is not perceived as something irregular. And in the cases of region, we also detect, for example, that if district attorney invites someone who's placing the complaint from the corner bar to or are asking the woman to have a drink or to have some type of sexual contact, it is perceived as better care and because there's more interest in their case. Thus, I believe here there is an important challenge from an invisibilization point of view, but also from a normalization point of view, and understanding these conduct types as corruption because the currency of exchange is presented as das Chile. You had an important reform in November 2018 where precisely it was limited and open to other favor types and thus done in a different logic, done in a logic of the car, the deluxe watch, this type of gifts. But it opens the door to understanding these other types where we can manifest these types of bribery and corruption. So basically, what is being said here is that in the gender dimension, sexual violence is relevant for such a multi-dimensional and complex issue of corruption in itself. Thank you very much. What an interesting to be able to establish these bonds in a more clear way. Thank you for that. And now the relevance and why we consider this dialogue important to look Lourdes from a point of view, a practical point of view, as what Linda just said, Ana Linda said regarding, for example, this complaint. So what would be the difficulties in research of the identification to be able to research this phenomenon, to able to tend towards it. What have you seen? What happens in these complaints? Are there sufficient, is there sufficient knowledge of the people whom acquire or do these complaints where we can say that we are truly facing the phenomenon? Daniela, I will answer. I'm going to do a disciplined presentation, but without first giving you the congratulations of the controllers and the OLACEFS works to proposing the issue, considering the triple vertex, first in women's issues, and in second place, because it affects the institutions to the integrity and prove why life of institution, and in a third way, and in general to all society, to all citizens, and citizens especially, that we have rights towards solid democracies, advanced democracies that are not due to the privilege and subjudging, submission, or abuse of others, and especially or majority of others. So thank you very much. And institutionally and personally. Institutionally, because I come in representation also of an external control institution, even though specialized in control of corruption through concrete case research and also general prevention. And in general sense, thus in complete synchronization, where it's difficult to propose sexual corruption as a true form of corruption. Corruption is easily defined as abuse of position to public corruption, the abuse of public position to have a private success or benefit. But we do not only, not necessarily must it be mentioned to economic or not have interiorized that it could also be referring to the non-economic corruption, but also can it be about self-use for one's self or thirds for other political parts which can be immediate or deferred. Something that brings us quickly to this modern way, the head of corruption, this economy of corruption where there's no equal exchange, thus an exchange of favors. Thus corruption has many modalities, and when we look at it with gender lenses, we realize that it affects disproportionately to women. There is an unequal impact. There's feminization of the levels of corruption, just like feminization of poverty, since there's a disequal impact. There are also differences in those that may affect everyone. It may affect a man, yes, but unproportionately to adult women or girls, and also to these others, people whom have what Umberto poetically calls non-conformist gender, heteronormative or trans people, the LGBT collective, have more facilities to become victim or survivor of these modalities of sexual corruption. This is as an introduction, but I will now be more disciplined and answer your two questions. We talked about, Ana Linda says, and Susana with more criteria than I, which is one of the pleasures to be here and to be able to share a table where people whom have researched these systems for many years and are references of the systems of these for years. So I am happy to share synchronically or asynchronically the session with them will answer. We said that corruption or sexual corruption or sextortion is a silenced or maybe the most silent form of corruption. Corruption is by definition an elusive phenomenon. It's a bodiless crime. With sextortion, we don't find that there are black figures. It's almost no figures. And Linda referred to some of the 2019 barometer data, even more updated information that I knew of and I've written on, but we find that we don't have statistics. In Spain, we don't have statistics on sextortion, nor idea of how the phenomenon is so much. And having this identified and to be able to count it, to, in other words, to able to establish patterns, how they respond, and in which surroundings to dimension it, and we have no idea of what we tend to face. And it seems real that we are able to dimension garbage production in a summer resort then to be able to count such lesions to people's souls. So it's important to have statistics and data. I don't have them for Spain, but if we go to tentative predictions, a quite concerning figure is that 40% of people in Spain have had sexual harassment in one point of their lives. 40% of women. Thus, we're at figures that are not of sextortion, but which show us a quite desolate scenario. You talked in second place of not only identify, but to also to denounce. But if sextortion escapes our statistics, it also escapes the radar of official denouncement. But it's the main mechanism for detection. Thus, to be able to detect this, to be able to prosecute and sanction. Thus, if sextortion is not announced and we cannot act upon them and we cannot prosecute and punish, we thus have results of impunity. And this reinforces the vicious circle to safely reinforce and reliably reinforce sexual corruption is one of the challenges that we face. The defects and deficits of sextortion accumulate the two areas that make hybrid sextortion and corruption. What then are the breaks to the corruption aspect? And I have data from Catalonia, which every 2 years regarding our area of action. The Catalonia office works upon a public sector of Catalonia of 7 million people with 325,000 people whom are in the public service, including elected officials. This is our universe, both regionally, like municipal, and we also have our own parliament. This is the universe on which we project ourselves. When you ask people then why they wouldn't denounce corruption, they give four answers, all independent of the person's willingness, which would be a potential denouncement of corruption. First place, because there's no proof, and this breaks approximately half the population. 30% more or less have a fear to being affected negatively when there is a corruption denouncement. In third place, it is quoted not knowing where to go and not thinking that their declaration will be correctly processed, that it will be useless and have no response. If this is translated into how an effective denouncement system should be made, there are three aspects and three areas. The first, it should be easy, simple, accessible, and no fear associated. Second, it has to be safe, creating safe alternatives to silence. In other words, confidential, possibly anonymous, and it offers reliability and safety to the person. Third, that it is efficient for something, that it truly offers a response in the system. If we achieve this, we will improve that information on corruption cases and we can research them better.
Now, with the problems of denouncing or complaining about corruption, we're talking about sexual abuse and we have the stigma culprit, and in some communities, denouncing this corruption is a turn against the people that actually makes the complaint, and that is seen something as something good, bad, because sexual abuse against women, it is used as a tool against the whole community. It is like challenging aspect for the collective ones. So the problems that we have also the problems of the abuse and the judgment and the suits related to this kind of behavior. We have a double exposition of women, and that is a step back. In that way, we are going to disincentive the complaints, the formal denounces, because we are not protecting in a different and the right way to the people that needs to be protected. We are improving some aspects. It is not related to sextortion because it's something new as the name, but we are moving towards improvement step by step, and we are still cannot have real solid experiences of improvement. That when we talk about infractions and denounces of other behaviors, we do have advances. There is a European directive of protection of people for public contracted hiring. But I think that is a very important milestone because you have better channels to denounce, but it's also done through a package of support model for the people that denounce, that complain. And that is something that we need to follow when we have this kind of denunciations or reports. And also psychological, economical support, all of these measures of protection for people that are only in the European Union. For some cases, they can be allowed to improve the treatment of sextortion. And regarding the sexual violence, we have some steps forwards. For example, to include Euro as a crime, violence towards women, that it is backed up with the Istanbul Agreement, not only with the partners or former partners, but any kinds of violence for women, and just because they are women. So Daniel, I'm going to stop talking here, not to take all the time with my mic. I'm going to be paying attention to continue the interaction with the rest of the people involved in this conversation. Yes, there are a lot of things that we can go very deep down into. Let's see what the audience said with this question that we have here. We asked, have you ever experienced or do you know somebody that an authority has requested directly or indirectly a sexual favor? And this, it is, I am really bad with maths, but let's say that almost 20 or more of the half of the people that answer, they have the experience or they know somebody that have experienced this. It's important to have data, to have these actions taken. Any comment about this? Are you surprised about this result? Well, the audience that is with us today are our colleagues that work mainly in the supervision entities in the region, but this invitation was open to everyone, but mainly we have people from our area. What causes, what is your reaction to this result? I was listening to Analinda that did this general view of vulnerable situations and victims of the migration and the problem they have. She talked about the spaces and the need of access to services to go back or help to the people and the victims. So many times when we talk about sextortion, we associate it to vulnerable situations in environments that are very specific, as I am the only European one here in this panel. And sometimes we have some moral superiority, like a prejudice, thinking that, and I see it sometimes, the ill-called countries of the first world is extortion. It is only affecting third world countries, but, or something for poor people. And I would like to emphasize this, that evidently in situations where we have need, the strong need to have main services like water or electricity, migration related aspects. Of course, there especially we have a more serious degree of death situation because they don't have a choice. They are actually against the wall. This is not exclusive anyway. It can happen in any environment as long as you have somebody in position able to abuse of their powers. They can, and if you want to obtain something out of that person, you can just make them do this. So when we talk also about the prevention of sexual corruption, it is focusing in their risks. Risks of corruption, it is always there. But when somebody has the possibility to exert this powerful situation with resources, they have the possibility of misusing this power. So what we have to do is to manage those risks to have the less possible impact. It would be, of course, more complicated when you have more levels of or higher levels of needs. So people that are under this situation, this scenes, this environment, of course, they are even farther away from justice, but it could happen in any context. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you for that insight. Analinda, would you like to add something about these results? I think it is really interesting to, and I am really happy actually. It is not, I am really happy because you did a very similar survey last year and it didn't show high numbers like this. So I feel that since you started doing this process till today, we have a higher understanding and visibilization of the problematic. And we see people of the whole region that actually are, these people are in contact with these cases, and this is a high number. It is alarming. It is a real problem that for the building of the public policies, it is really important, but it doesn't, actually it's showing that these numbers are really high. It is the same as the other, as we talked in the last session, we talk about this with the international transparency in Peru chapters and other situations. We have seen this. And I think that the more we understand, the more we deal with this and we raise the more awareness of this, it is going to allow us to dimension, to provide a different perspective of this problem. And of course, this is going to be even clearer to call more attention to this, even if we have the typification or not, but the path of attention of these cases, it is fundamental to understand it as corruption and sexual violence. And when you talk about this anti-corruption system, the handling of that case is fundamental. And we have to give it a proper dimension. And something that Lourdes said, it is really important. This has a component because it is more present, of course, related to the access to services, rights, and conditions of vulnerability makes this even more serious in terms of their presentation, the victims of human trafficking, etc. But the other thing it is important, it is the where. For example, London police have done a very important investigation about these cases of sextortion in different workers that were working with survivors, women survivors that entered the protection system. because of gender violence or domestic violence, and how they are. And we have the different typologies and classifications. It's very serious study that the London police did. And precisely the people that should protect these women are the ones that are, again, the threat. It's a different way of violence. And in Spain, we have detected also interesting cases in terms of, in the context of jails, in order some workers or some public employees, in order not to send them back to their countries in the migration context, they requested sexual favors. And in United States also we have some cases, neurosocial investigations and research that, for example, shows that people that work in the distribution of medication and drugs, they distribute illegally some medication in change of sexual favors. So this is a very serious area. We are talking about addiction, and we are talking about public policies that are so seriously damaged, where we have, this is the context of this abuse. So it is this deviation of this role that it is actually helping them. It's supposed to be social benefits, and they just turn it into their own benefit that with these sexual favors. And honestly, I think that my question is related or going towards, as a society, what kind of analysis we have to make? What is the understanding? How we use this as a currency to pay these transactions? And maybe that is the question that we have to focus on and reflect about. And we are challenged here with the current understanding of corruption. It is not the person that is corrupted. I think that in Latin America, you cannot think that the corruption, it is something, many times it's more systemic. So I would like to invite to not understand this as a small scale corruption, because also it is related to human rights. It is not a small because of that, but additionally, I believe that when we are facing this context of corruption, that it is more systemic, complex, articulated, even with some factors that in which the state it is facilitated the situation. For example, human trafficking. Great part of the labor protection, or it is done actually by criminal organizations, and the fact that these situations are associated to those networks of corruption that favored the great criminal activity as organized crime or any other kind of big entities that are corrupted. We need to get some distance from this and to think corruption in terms of this interchange of individuals, and to see it in a systemic way, and how this sexual corruption system adds up to that dimension of great criminal activities. So, of course, this is related to what Lourdes says. We have the issues with compliance, behavior, and the protection to the people that is allegating this. But there are some points that, just to redimension the elements of corruption and their relation with these manifestations of sexual violence. Thank you. We have so much to do, and there are so many elements where we can eventually advance and work. But I think that the revictimization of women that are exposed to the agents of the states that are in charge of their safety and taking care of them. So it is Amazing, but in the next year, we are going to have a coordinated audit to talk about also about this. You are welcome to participate. And then we are going to have, of course, the survey and audit to get the data and then try to find ways to repair and to fix the situations. So the most important thing first is to have data to act on this. Let's continue with interacting with the audience. We are going to have another invitation for you. Use the Zoom platform down there. You have in the toolbar, you have questions and answers, Q&A. You can write down your questions there and we can ask the questions to the panelists later. And also the next question in Menti 42587454 is the code for you to answer the question. How common do you think it is sextortion inside of the public apparatus or entities? Okay, we want to know your perception and please participate with this question in menti.com. Let's go back with Lourdes to talk about prevention. As you said, and I'm going to be out of the agenda, but you said something about this, and I'm interested in talking about more this. How do you see prevention? Because these dimensions, every part is really complicated. Violence against women, corruption, and we have the other area that it is the visibilization of the inaction that we may think that it's not collaborating, but how do you see this whole thing? Daniela, I think it is really strong, everything. It's really shocking. And I am surprised and also sad because when we listen at the police or some collectives that are exerting or acting in this context of desperate women, but in the case of judges that they themselves can be actually the origin of the sextortion. So they have the power to deny or to grant some things. They also have this obligation to care about this. And in this case, it's double serious. In the case of the prevention, I think that sextortion is one way of corruption, but all the approximations that we have to prevent corruption are important. To fight against corruption, it is related to punishment. So the typification of sextortion in the legislation, it is not present and we can improve it, but we need to improve the punishment. The penal code, actually, when we talk about the final section, it is the last stop before. But what do we do before? If we think that the exercise of making this public, it is risky itself, because in that process you can have again the power abuse. We have to reassess this and we have to anticipate to this control. And how do you do this? Strengthening the systems inside of the institutions. We can have some flow chart in order to know how this or any organization, they have an integrity system, and this explains why we have some institutions that are less or more ways of solving these issues, but these opportunities have to be effective, and usually they are done in the minimum possible. Examples of how this corruption can be prevented and also sextortion, we have to take into account the organizational culture, and we work with ethic codes through any instrument that allow us to ground the values and principles that are in the legal declaration to help people and to act to generate this culture an ethic culture and integral culture. I'm talking about leadership as well. And for example, the general controllerships of Chile, he expressed the commitment to push forward this kind of session and this kind of diverse actions to improve the soundness, how strong and robust are the external organs of supervision. That is fundamental to express this commitment with this kind of behavior. That is part of the prevention. There are other ways like improving the denouncement or complaint mechanisms, to have different studies of risks and control points, and also acting in a general way, and not only in the organization, but also we have to work with social campaigns for awareness, sessions of awareness and conversation. These are tools, education, not only, and I'm not talking about kids or adults, I'm talking about this being part of the curriculum of judges and different professionals. And this fact of naming this old situation, it is just the first step, but we are very behind in everything else. And so we have this case in Singapore with a judge that says that we need two hands to applaud, emphasizing with this comment that you need to have this consent in one of the sides. And when we talk about cultural changes and prevention, I'm talking about the cultural changes in relation to consent. So, for example, the merit of Me Too that has been really highly criticized, but I think we have a merit here. We have rethought about consent. We know that a kid of 10 years old cannot consent to sexual relation. A drunken woman also cannot grant consent. Maybe we have to be repetitive about that consent, because a woman in an asymmetrical situation, it is not when they are in the less powerful position in comparison to the public power. This is not consent, and language is really important. Mrs. Cameron, a sociolinguist of Oxford, she says that language has helped us in the definition of sextortion, because language is diminishing or taking importance of the situation, consent, sex, and many times those offers are not clear. It is very easy to read between lines here. So to talk about transactional sex of sexual favors is not right, because this implies a free consent that is very far from reality in these cases. So culture of consent is really important. The culture of silence, because with the culture of silence and the culture of abuse is related, because we are not used to denounce. We are some actually accomplices, because this is a very hostile system to treat properly and also to protect this person. But in the case of sextortion, it is double complicated in the measure that this complexity of the involvement in the environment, in the context, it is an extra handicap concept. So I think that the cultural changes in terms of consent and complaint are important parts of what I call general prevention, and that will also be part of the educational aspects and also the training and the curriculum for the professionals. No doubt, actually, we agree with that. Now, because we don't have a lot of time, I think that before giving the word to Ana Linda, we are going to go with the second intervention of Dr. Medina, about typification, and then we are with Annalena, we are going to continue. But remember, Menti.com is there, and we have the Q&A for the questions. So let's continue with the presentation. And when we did this investigation, we faced many barriers because we wonder why, if it is so well-known behavior that exploded just a few years ago with the Me Too movement, with different actresses said that, and tell everyone that they had in order to get a main character or to be the actresses in one series or movie, they were requested sex in change. And this exploded in the sports world, in photography world, and all the areas, modeling. And many women actually, they confess this and they dare. That's why me too. I also suffer this. Some the barriers that were presented actually were the fear. They were ashamed, of course, and they hold it for so long because they felt vulnerable. They felt ashamed because they felt that they agreed to that, for that misbehavior. And the legislation must, and because it's not typified in the whole world, is not penalized. But even when we talk about against corruption, it is not categorized as corruption. It is not taken into account this way of corruption, that it is obtaining these sexual favors. And the legislation here is really weak, and it is not taking into account these new ways that are coming in the new times, in the latest times. And now, after many years, we have a sanction for eliminating proofs against these situations, but there is also, this topic has been dealt in international human rights conferences, and we are going to now to work, actually we are working in the definition of gender violence, but so far we haven't obtained the typification of this very soft way of corruption. And if the institution resources are not enough, and this is just left behind, and we need to inform, raise awareness, sensibilize everyone, so people know that this is something that it cannot be tolerated as a behavior. This is why we have to make this issue visible, because we have to name the problem. The name, we already have it, sextortion. And also we have to name it first to make it visible. Then we have to identify the barriers. First, the natural barriers of the victim herself, and then the institution and social and legal barriers, because it is not classified, this way of corruption. And it is important that in each of our countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, we can identify the resources that talk about, the legal resources that talk about corruption. And if this legal resource in some point mention this type of behavior.
Esto, elaborar un plan de
And
acción.
facing this, we have to elaborate an action plan among all the non-governmental organization like ours, the Association of Judges and the Penalist Judges of the Republic of Argentina, and all organizations that are in different countries of Latin America. Because the movement of Not One More or Me Too were strengthened by these organizations. It is now time to start among all of what sextortion is and what it implies.
Sí, que todo
Yes,
lo que hemos conversado está en esta
it's
línea.
all what we've
Y
talked
qué interesante lo
has
que tú
gone
dices,
along this line. And
porque
how
como
interesting it
dijiste,
seems,
el
Linda,
sistema
so that we can
ya,
briefly
ya
speak of
aludió
the subject
recién
that was
la
briefly
doctora Medina
mentioned
en torno a una de estas
by Dr.
barreras, barreras
Medina
legales.
on the barriers, on the
¿Cuáles
legal barriers.
serían
What would
entonces
be then,
los
in your
componentes que debería
expertise, the
tener una
components that a
tipificación
good
de este
typing should
fenómeno?
have of the phenomenon?
¿Hay algún lugar donde nosotros
Is
podamos
there
irnos
some place
alguna
where
institucionalidad que ustedes
any
consideren que tenga
institutionality
referencia,
that
alguna
have the
práctica
reference of good practices to be followed? Please share with us. Yes, before going basically into the subjects of typing, I do believe it's important to understand what the judge says. We have to make dimension the problem and understand how it's manifested, because sextortion is one form of manifestation, or the issues of sexual corruption. It's possible that the phenomenon is even broader and requires of a much more integrated system. Thus, it is important here that it is evidenced that sextortion, just like with bribery, is an emblematic crime. Thus, to answer how it is manifested, dimension it, and evidence that it requires a public policy construction makes it very important. In other words, each country not just typify or type it just to type it. In other words, to generate empathies towards societies, to tend to a subject that had not been tended to before. Here, it's important that its typing is an element and a very door of entry, but we also look for a system of understanding, detection, prevention, prosecution, and care for these cases. Thus, one of these elements, one of these possible crimes then is sextortion, but it is a system that must be created because, well, before a being a crime, corruption is a social issue, and this implies several of the things that Lourdes mentioned regarding prevention and others. So it is a call before going into typing itself. Now, cataloging, the challenge here is how we realize then it's two sides of a same coin. There's a component for corruption, there's a sexual violence component to it. And thus, why do we need in a 99.9% of the cases it's correct typing? Because if it's maintained only as corruption or sexual violence, you realize that there's a lack of equality in these processes. In other words, that it's the criteria of whom would receive the information would go in one sense or the other. Quality, the equality in care, the fundamental right that will not be seen nor attended comprehensively. It in this sense that I mentioned, because there are countries where these cases are being seen as corruption, but it is just an example. In Colombia, there are sentences, but not having the dimension, well, there's no true justice administration. Thus, a type up to the date, there's like a dichotomy proposed of the very few sentences offered. Is it sexual violence or corruption? It's not either, it's both. So it comes from the need, and it's need of typing. What examples are in the region? Spain has an important articulate that talk of its complicating factors as a crime. And that's in the practice, there are challenges, and that is that it is not necessarily cared, the victim is not cared for correspondingly as a victim of sexual violence. Spain and Peru, as I've said, have very interesting cases because it's of the very few countries that have even important decision making like corruption, but with a serious lack, and it's where the repair or reparation, since corruption is a government crime, reparation repair for me, Daniela, as you said, rep, we re-victimize. It's almost like the judicial system makes it instrumentalized and does not recognize it as a crime. So recently, I must congratulate Peru in work since 2019 practically. We've created a step-by-step roadmap of how to reach a possible typing from the help of Eurosocial, and the president of Peru has sent the emergency of typification and as it is a complicating towards the crime of corruption. And this is a good example. What you're doing in Chile with your bill of law. So there are some examples in other contexts, and the report that Lourdes referenced, the 2020 of international transparency, brings context, other examples in other contexts. But I think the Spain case would be the most relevant one that we can have. In this case of the Peruvian Bill of Law is another initiative because it comes with the criterious exercise with step-by-step support. But my invitation is more than just typing. If I do not create a system where I am able correctly define that when it goes into the justice system, where will the case go? Whom will tend to it? What groups of tasks? Because we've seen an anti-corruption fiscal attorney won't be able to work this. We will need the experience of others because the test will not be the same. Or, in other words, the nature of the evidence needed. So we needed work groups, protocols, ways of articulation, intra people working, detections. For example, in the case of Argentina, many of the detection of these case types are seen with what I call are like interdisciplinary denouncements. Thus, they come in and it is a source of information for them. And I see the comptrollers whom has contact with the reality of the entities may have the possibility then of detecting if an official is trained for. Peru, we used to talk with the people of victim care and violence care. They're doing these workshops and work, and they would say yes. What's so easy for us to add to a protocol and a question that's saying that in exchange of a sexual favor, did the official ask for something? That sexual favor was in exchange for something? This offers a corruption scenario not only of sexual violence, so including something in the protocol. So what I wish to say is typing is fundamental. It gives a framework and a basis that we've all mentioned with the examples I've given, mainly Spain and the process. But the design of the system that this case will treat, how it will come and will follow and is equal or more important than the typing itself. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would love to be able to ask you so many things. Lourdes, you want to ask something? Just briefly. Ana Linda says that in Spain, at some moments and in some aspects, may be a reference. Yes, it is true that in the last penal code showed an improvement after the recommendations of the Greco group, but likewise, there are infra-penalization risks. Even we've improved its issuance, not understand what sextortion truly is, and it is not well designed, even though there is a difficult article that does not define the name but does treat the conduct, there's still a lot of gaps. In other words, there are scenarios of impunity, for example, sentences where the type of sexual favors are asked not on behalf of officials of penitentiary institutions, which is one of the aspects that the article covers. Thus, this same equivalent and completely occurring in a Malagan penitentiary is so it means that we haven't interiorized, as Ana Linda said, is a multi-offensive figure. The women's sexuality is endangered, and also the public policies whose officials must carry out their functions according to general interest and not personal interest. And this is still not interiorized. Before I agree with Ana Linda, it's the last of it all. For example, there's an important subject that we haven't been able to implant successfully in any places that the channels for denouncement are sensitive to gender. The institutions that fight against corruption in gender in general can improve their channels, but not for sexual corruption itself. So thus it is important that in determined situations, specific people exist specially informed in sextortion to receive these complaints, and this does not occur. And the other would be coordination. If this is a behavior that offends or affects different jurisdictional effects but are made hybrid, it's necessary that the institutions that struggle against each other be coordinated and talk among each other, and this doesn't happen. I leave it there unless I know Daniela is suffering and we need to answer questions from the audience. Yes, very interesting. Before going, I want to show the results of the second Menti question of what our audience has wished to answer. And here we have a curve where we wish to analyze how common is sex extortion public sector. 3.6 points of 5. Thus, we are a bit between a trend towards existing. I remember how these intermediate points existed, but here we could clearly graph this answer. And it is something, well, in general terms, we've talked slightly about. I wish to link this answer, this Menti answer, to some of the questions of the audience, which is very active today in the chat box. And there are several questions oriented towards the same sense. In one sense, Camila Felipe and an anonymous spectator asks us particularly regarding the complaint and denouncing regarding tests specifically and proof. How to denounce? Which proof is plausible? Because sometimes it is difficult. Sometimes these are just created, and they point out also that evidence is not presented and witnesses do not cooperate. The accused denies it. So I'm adding three questions here. And what Camila says so is how we can obtain this test because it becomes more and more subtle the need demand. What can you tell about us? What this point? When you can you tell us about this point? I don't know if I will be too categorical. Maybe Ana Linda can help. The test is the fear to not having proof is one of the things that breaks most the possibility of denouncing the fact. So it's important that institutions that implant denouncement channels that establish denouncement systems make clear that it's not necessarily to have proof at the beginning, but to whom it corresponds to look for evidence is the institution that's managing said proof. So it's important for sexual corruption and other corruption types because often to try to incorporate evidence in the beginning makes places in risk the person who is creating the announcement. Thus, it is important to note the problems that usually are seen in spaces of opaqueness and silence. and it becomes complicated to accreditate proof. I don't know if Analinda, if you have references on how we favor evidence collecting in these points. Thank you. Well, all research has challenges. When we talk that this is a crime on both sides of the coin, we have a double challenge. We have challenge where we must investigate corruption, and our challenge is to show gender violence. In the case of violence, of gender violence, I think Lourdes mentioned the issue of consent is also an important thing to analyze. So understanding that this and researching in general any type of crime of the nature, difficulties are presented here. The double nature places us in a quite more special circumstances. Well, first, these challenges to reach an announcements or denouncement, I think that campaigns like done, for example, in Transparency Seen in Chile, where we begin to show that this is a crime and this is corruption, it becomes important because it is not only the invisibilization, as I've said, the difficulties of looking where these cases are at, but the normalization. In other words, for many people, for many surviving victims, these types of requests are part of the culture of the environment. Thus, to understand that this is not correct and must be announced is fundamental. Obviously, that these places or centers for care, there's a protocol created, for example, for SALAX, an anti-corruption center. In Chile, we have someone who comes, who's leading the subject, Tanya, have already a root of cases with perspective and understanding of these types of sexual violence perspective. So this institutional prepare of civil society to receive and understand these cases as commented, like along the line of care of gender violence in Peru, and how they ask this for the line of care in people trafficking in Argentina. And so how you detect these corruption cases become fundamental. What's second in all of this work, in this regional work of understanding, is to keep awareness because they believe that research is victim centered. In other words, if the victim, thus there's no case, and this tends to happen in the cases of sexual violence. Thus, please keep an eye out of how we overcome this understanding and thus the creativity, because to do proactive intelligent research we need to open understanding both for analysis and research of the cases, and to understand it shouldn't be victim-centered research. I have more resources and more elements to research. I want to place an example of a case of Chile where we are seeing situations of sexual exploitation mission. I don't know to what level there was a mission, but there was a mission. There was a sexual exploitation of a clearly youth, and nothing would happen. And special research techniques were done. There was follow-up and observation on behalf of the researcher in field of the circumstances. In other words, special research techniques were used. Here, researching is costly. Thus, our countries make prioritization of cases. Thus, we prioritize great corruption cases for understanding it as more amount of money, but understanding it as great corruption because there's no organization for human rights. And as society and states, it is important for us. Thus, clearly, this should imply research is important and also a lacking that is in this case that had follow-up and has brought important aspects of the investigation are investigations in Latin America. I could say practically do not have most as is the research acts in itself, analysis for criminal analysis, different forms of analysis generates an understanding of the typology, of a clear typology associated to victim societies and police groups. To have more analysis capacity, both in prosecution, is fundamental and will save time, understanding, and will help us to detect, as Lourdes said, where these elements, higher risk elements are at, and what type of service, for example. Thus, the barometer for transparency said to access health and education, there is more higher risk. So we have to see where we have to place a higher focus or higher early alerts or higher red flags to understand.
Tipo de servicio se da, en qué tipo de instituciones puede haber mayor vulnerabilidad para este tipo de cosas.
And
Entonces,
in what situations and can we see more vulnerability? So to strengthen investigation, not only for concrete cases, but understanding of its manifestations, of where my risks are at, and how I generate action courses for research is fundamental.
también que, y ahí ponía el
I
ejemplo
was
de
also talking about, with the example in Argentina, when we talk about administration, for example, the reports of the discipline, and that happens a lot in the police and in different cases of different workers, public employees, that they have this report good a complaint or bad behavior, they take it, they analyze it, and then of course they have gotten different cases of corruption and sexual corruption cases out of that. So where are the other workers in the case of Colombia, for example, the controllership office and other institutions that can help us detect if they are undergoing this bad behavior? So I think that finally, for the whole issue, the challenges and the tasks that we have to have are fundamental to work with the researchers, investigators that have expertise in the issues related to gender violence. So we can see this road that step by step and to take the advantages of investigation of each felony, this is going to be fundamental. This and also to close, you mentioned this about the protection of the complainer, and when Chile started analyzing everything related to this, they talked about the system of the protection of the person that makes this allegation. And the key here, it is to understand that women don't see the same. And when they have the consequences are not the same, or it is not the same payback when they denounce. So to understand this difference can help us to build better working systems to respond in terms of prevention and persecution. I would like to add one thing, Daniela. When we talk about analysis of this, that pattern of displacing the interest of the fact towards the origin of the reason of the why they denounced, but actually it is just to put into the question to the victim. It is something that has to be said and prevented, because that it is a common pattern in corruption. It is evident that we have some bias of gender, but in general this happens. We have some deviation from the analysis of the fact that is the center, and then the analysis of the motivation situation, the personality, or the behavior, the context, and that is important. It is important as well to accompany the person that is denounced and the legal support, because they usually are is scared to be blamed, to be the ones that created the situation or to corrupt the public worker. So to have this public support, it is important. It is this a system of denounces and not a channel of denounces. It has to be sensitive to the gender, but also it is not just the channel. It has to be an integral system. And that it is what we have to change, the culture, the denounce channels specifically when they have this difference in gender. And you just made me remember, Danielle, I'm sorry, but I need to say this. They are going to have to just make us leave, yeah. In Chile, I was told that there is this expression that it is really interesting in terms of social or culture is to train the eye. And I think that training the eye, it is really good because it's one of the most important steps, because many times we want to have more information and sometimes we have a lot of information, but we don't see it. I don't know, in Argentina, they have a report because they did some surveying of the information and they realized that almost all the calls talk about the mayor, the public worker, the supervisor, the police. So it is there, but in a case like human trafficking, where the priorities are exactly helping the victim and the exploitation, actually, the human trafficking is something that it is discarded because it is not the priority line of attention to when you talk about human trafficking, but the information about the corrupt public worker is there, but it is to train the eye, the ear, because I know what it is corruption. And then we can talk about from where we are going to gather the information. The Superior Court of Argentina already said you have to investigate the whole line related to corruptions, because there are going to be judicial decisions that alongside the investigation, you have those data disappearing, or even evidence of corruption is being disappeared because it's not priority of the investigation. So what the Superior Court is saying, okay, pay attention to this. It is a fundamental element, corruption here. When we think about in the ProQ and the reciprocity aspect, you give me and I give you, and what do I get for this? So when you see it as in the systemic way, you realize that this is favoring or being instrumental for other kinds of behavior. And I think it is important to detect the components of corruption that are associated to this behavior. I think that we are just running out of time and we could be talking about this for a long time. We have a long conversation pending for the future to talk about the particularities of this phenomenon.
Agradecerles la
And just to close and to say thank you for your participation, and also thank you to Susana. I would like to give you 1 minute to each of you. And I think that this is something we have to do for you to give us a piece of advice. How do we have to do the surveillance and the supervision? And how you said, Lourdes, in your welcoming words, we have to understand the different impact of corruption and women. Your final piece of advice, 1 minute each, because audience is already leaving because we are over time. Who wants to start? Very fast. I will take from Analinda the idea of training the eye and to put these purple glasses. When we work with corruption, for us it's really difficult to see the corruption that doesn't have a financial effect. We have to correct that. We are biased and we have to be aware of it. In our office, we're working step by step, and one of the steps it is to add data to our barometer and to see that women perceive more corruption than men. We have a lot of challenges, that our channels of denounces are sensible to gender. We have to ask the right questions that actually tell us what are the results of the statistics to make it more visible. We can deal with it and we can denounce it in a better way, and to never forget about prevention and education. So I would like to finish saying congratulations for this session, because we are not having a lot of these situations, and I am learning a lot with this. Thank you for the opportunity, and this is very updated information compared. It is very wide scene. So let's train the eye, and from humbleness, we have to explore, and we have this commitment that is not only for women, but it is a commitment with the integrity of the institutions, and that it is our mandate in the case of our institutions. So maximum empathy with the Controllership's office in Chile, and thank you for the opportunity. And just to repeat what I said, I'm happy to be in this meeting, and actually adding everything that says Lourdes just said, I will add, why is it important? Why should I see this? Because I am managing resources, and the topic related to deviation, I think the deviation of what it should be, that public investment, and to take this concept of deviation in management of resources, I think it is the key in which we have to work. You already started with the controllerships there in Chile, and I saw some news about the steps that they are going to take after these findings, working efficiently with different service programs, with the women department and programs. So we have these findings in terms of management of those public resources. So the deviation and the management are going to give us the key. I know a case in Argentina where for providing scholarships or to be granted or a public position, they were granted because of sexual favors, and this operated like an administration of services for the public officers, and that it is the deviation of as its best definition, because the mission for them, they have to comply with this. It was not being complied. I mean, their mission, their mandate, it is not being complied with. So if we are going to go back to basics, that corruption implies an idea of deviation, and we realize that the payment of that deviation, it is being the currency, it's the sexual favor, that it means that we are witnessing a corruption scene, and this is a deviation of the resources, and we are in an area of knowledge that and an area that the controllership office can have influence in. I think this is just the main gate, because we have a lot to talk about this. And we also, coming back to the multinational aspect, many of these cases or investigations have happened in Latin America, investment in social programs for women, and these resources are deviated in exchange of votes and this is a problem that is important in Central America, but the investment of social programs is defined, one, in terms of corruption of hiring, buying votes, and a series of characteristics that are actually changing in the public system. Another piece of important information, we have had several researches or investigation about the budgets in the region that are supported by the political parties for gender issues. They are not being invested in gender issues. Maybe there are some cases in which this is deviated and invested in the flowers, because the flowers are for women, for the event, but that is the way in which you invest the resource that it was to distinct for strengthening the political participation of women is not being done in the right way. So I think the concept of deviation and management of resources that focus in gender, the impact on women, and everything that we have discussed today, I think it is the entrance, the main, like the welcome hall of these cases, and the regulation that we have seen around this concept of protecting the denouncing party. So I think that we have to continue, and we are in the right direction, but this is an important momentum with the international framework, legal framework, and we can move forward very much more, but still there is a lot to do pending. So let's take this opportunity and to use this momentum as much as we can. And we are going to have the closing words of Miss Susana Medina. So please, the video. To change the attitude and to commit with these new ways of corruption, it is not easy. It hasn't been easy. When we talk about this, we have been doing since 2008 with different activities, conferences, and congresses. We have been working on this, and activities like this, conversation to install the topic in the public agenda, and that it is possible to make it visible. We have to disrupt the society about this. This has to be in an interdisciplinary study that in all areas, we have to talk about these new ways of corruption. So we can just put it or translate it into legal ideas that can be added to the regulation, and we can modify the legislation, and from there we can modify the legal scope. And everything needs to be focused also in the gender violence. We have moved forward a lot in terms of laws for gender identity, different laws with different violence related and protection related laws. And we can continue talking about that. Many other laws that have been approved in the last 20 years, but we have been actually the first ones to have this legislation that is really advanced and is also has been helped by the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And this topic related to gender equality is fundamental to change the attitudes and behaviors. It hasn't been easy. It's always difficult to do this, but I do believe it is possible. So from this association, I had the honor to be working here in the International Association of Women Judges, and since 2016, we are strongly committed with making this issue visible, and that's why I say thank you again in the controller. Thank you to the controllership's office in Chile, because you are helping to make this issue visible and to support this new way of fighting corruption. And I repeat again, it is not the financial and economical corruption. It is also another corruption that affects the Republican system. We want a life free of corruption. And the only way to have it, it is to do this, to finish with this insidious perspective. Thank you very much. And with those words of Susana Medina, thank you again. Her virtual presence, and Ana Linda and Lourdes' presence. It has been a pleasure to have you with your presentations here, with this very interesting conversation that is not coming only from me, but also the different comments in the chat. We see the interest of people continuing to talk about this. So thank you for everyone being here and to join us and to participate with us in this journey and this desire, this dream. So from the coordination of this group of work, thank you very much, Nayaded, and the colleagues from the Controllership's office, everyone in the production, in the organization. It seems that we hope actually to have supported and contributed a little bit to raise awareness about this very common phenomenon, and we hope to have initiatives that are good and going in the same line for the future. So sometimes it looks something simple, that actually we can work together and we can empower each other. And for this, it's really important to have a lot of women here talking about leadership in this area. So now I'm going to greet everyone, and the recording of this video is going to be available in the OLACEFS channel, and you can just play it as many times as you want and share it. Thank you everyone for participating, and see you the next time. Thank you, Daniela, and to the whole team.